Throughout the middle of the last century, Dorothy Hartley travelled the length and breadth of the country to write about the life and works of the people of England. So we are here at the Museum of English Rural Life to uncover some of the stories of the people. This episode, the Wainwright. Once, not very far from these parts, there lived a man called George, who was a king, and who was also rather mad. However, this story is not about him. This story is about ordinary folk like you and me, who had humble professions. One of them was a man called George, and he was a butler who served the mad king. And that butler had a wagon that had been built for him by a wainwright, whose name was George. George the wainwright was a very skilled carpenter, excellent at building wagons and fixing their wheels whenever it was needed. And George had a wife. Her name is kind of lost to history, so for the purposes of this story, we'll call her Mrs. George. Now, George really fancied Mrs. George, but he knew he wasn't going to be able to take advantage of her with George in the way. So George decided to get rid of George by exploiting his connection to King George. Are you with me so far? Okay, well, I'll try and slow it down a little bit. George the butler wanted to get rid of George the wainwright, and after a little bit of forethought, he came up with the perfect plan, exploiting his connection with King George. First, he really carefully studied ancient calligraphic arts until he was pretty good at writing it out himself. And after preparing a fantastic letter, he folded it all up and rushed straight to King George to say, Your Majesty, I had an incredible dream where I got to see all of the company of heaven, and two of them, St. Peter and St. Paul, both passed me this letter. And when I woke up, I was clutching this letter still in my hands. I thought I had to give it to you. Well, King George took the letter. Because he wasn't very good at reading, he passed it over to one of his servants to read. And the letter read as follows. George, you have been such a good boy. Now, from those words, King George knew straight away that this letter was from his father, the King George, who had recently passed away and gone to heaven. The letter continued. I'm having such a fantastic time in heaven. I've been really well received here. I've even been given a fantastic mansion. The trouble is that my mansion is really far from the capital of heaven, which means that I have quite a long journey every day, and my wagon is in need of some new wheels. I don't suppose you know any good wainwrights or wheelwrights who might be able to come up to heaven and repair them for me? Well, when King George heard this, he turned to his butler George and said to him, Do you know of any good wainwrights or wheelwrights who might be able to repair the wheels on my father's wagon in heaven? Well, George the butler had a rather happy smile spread across his face as he said, Oh yes, Your Majesty, I know just the man. When George the wainwright found out that the king wanted to see him about some really important task, he was so excited. He rushed to the palace, he bowed down before the king, saying, Your Majesty. And the king said, I hear that you are one of the best wainwrights in the land. Well, said George the wainwright, I do try my best. So, said King George, I have a very important task for you. I would like you to go and mend the wheels of my father's wagon. Your father's wagon? Yes. Your father who died recently? Yes. So your father's wagon is in heaven? Yes. when can you go?" Now, George the wainwright wasn't a simple man. He very quickly realized that someone had tried to set him up, but he hadn't the faintest idea who, and also, what could he do? If he were to refuse the king, he would surely end up in jail or worse. And he had to think of Mrs. George. So, eventually, George the wainwright could think of nothing but begging the king to give him a whole week to prepare everything he needed. And then he offered King George the chance to have a special wagon burning ceremony to help speed him on his way to mend King George's father George's wagon's wheel. The king agreed to that, and off went George the wainwright back to Mrs. George to let her know the very sad news that they only had 1 week left together. And for the rest of that week, George the wainwright and Mrs. George didn't get much sleep at all. At the end of that week, George the wainwright, with his box of tools and a few supplies, were loaded into a wagon, covered up with sticks, and then George the butler seemed to take great delight in being the one to hold a torch to the wagon and set it aflame. And moments later, the wagon was nothing but a pile of ashes, and George the wainwright was nowhere to be seen. George the butler waited about 2 weeks before he made his move on Mrs. George. He thought a fortnight was about enough time to get over your dead husband, right? And after that time, he got himself a nice huge bunch of flowers and went to Mrs. George's door, knocked upon it, and as she answered, he said, "Beautiful Mrs. George, I've noticed that you are still a little bit sad after the passing of your husband George. And when I was a child, it always used to cheer me up whenever my mother gave me a great big hug. So how about it? Now, Mrs. George looked George the butler up and down, and then very curtly said, "No, thank you," and closed the door, leaving George the butler rather confused. He was sure that 2 weeks would have been long enough to get over her husband, but maybe she needed 3. So he went away, and the next week he returned with the same bunch of flowers, knocked upon the door of Mrs. George, and whereupon she opened it, he said, "Beautiful Mrs. George, I've noticed that you are still just a little bit sad since the passing of your husband George, and well, whenever I was sad, it really cheered me up if a beautiful girl gave me a kiss. So how about it? Mrs. George looked George the butler up and down and then said, "No, thank you," and again closed the door, leaving George the butler even more confused. Surely 3 weeks would have been long enough to get over her husband. Clearly, though, she needed a little bit more time. So he waited for another week. It had been nearly a month now, so surely she would accept him this time. He returned to the door of Mrs. George with the same bunch of stems, knocked upon it, and when it was opened, he said, "Beautiful Mrs. George, I noticed that you are still a teeny bit sad about the passing of your husband George, but I also realized that the whole of this time I've only been thinking about what makes me happy. What made you happy was clearly having a husband called George. So how about you marry me? And this time, Mrs. George wasted no time. She just closed the door saying, "No, thank you," leaving George the butler even more confused. How could she not be over the death of her husband after an entire month? Maybe she needed just 1 more week. Mrs. George watched him go through her kitchen window, and as soon as he was out of sight, she picked up the tray of food that she had been cooking for her husband George, went to the back of the house where there were some steps leading down to the cellar, and at the bottom of those steps, she put down the food on a table right in front of her husband, George. George the wainwright was sat there next to a tunnel that led under the ground right to that pile of ashes where they had had the wagon burning ceremony 1 month ago. In his time in the cellar, George the wainwright had been very carefully studying ancient calligraphic arts until he was pretty good at copying it himself. And after having a conversation with Mrs. George about all of the attempts George the butler had made to win his way into her heart, George the wainwright knew exactly the kind of thing that he wanted to write. And since a whole month had passed, he was getting fairly tubby since he was just sitting in a cellar getting regular meals from Mrs. George. George the wainwright decided it was time to return from heaven. He put back on his finest clothes. He picked up his tools. He picked up his letter, put it in his pocket, and crawled back through that tunnel until he was able to burst out from that pile of ashes and declare, "I'm back from heaven!" Well, Mrs. George was one of the first on the scene, and she looked delighted. Others came very quickly to the spot, all of them amazed and astounded, though none more so than George the butler. George the butler couldn't believe that George the wainwright was actually back from heaven. And George the wainwright said, "Oh yes, I'm back, and you should have seen the wagon that King George's father George had up there. It was amazing. I had to do some real work to get the wheels absolutely right, but I think they were pretty impressed with me. I mean, look at how well I've been fed. I think they really, really like me. Oh, and they said, since they were sending me back, that I was to give this letter to His Majesty. You're his butler, aren't you? Could you take it to him for me?" George the butler took the letter all the way back to His Majesty King George, who passed it to one of his servants to read, since he wasn't very good at that himself. And so the servant read, "My dearest son George." Oh, it was another letter from his father George. "I am very pleased with the wainwright that you have sent me. He has done a fantastic job, and I hope you see to it that he is very handsomely rewarded. There is just one thing that I am missing now. You see, whenever I leave my huge mansion in heaven, I'm leaving it all alone and unattended. I think it's rather important that I get a butler. Do you know of any really good butlers that you could send up to me here in heaven?" Well, George, the Mad King, turned to George, his butler, and said, "George, you have been a fantastic butler to me for pretty much your entire life. So I would like to send you to be the butler for my father George in heaven." George the butler was quite confused by all of this. He started to think, maybe he had a magic power. Maybe people that he sent to heaven could actually return from heaven. So he accepted the job. And the very next day, they had a wagon burning ceremony for George the butler too. He climbed into that wagon, they covered him up with sticks, and then George the wainwright had the pleasure of setting fire to it. And after just a few moments, the wagon was nothing but a pile of ashes, and George the butler was nowhere to be seen. Now, King George's father George must have really liked George the butler, because unlike George the wainwright, George the butler never came back. But George the wainwright and Mrs. George lived long, happy lives together, fueled by the wealth that was bestowed upon them by King George, as his father George had wished. And just a little while later, George the wainwright and Mrs. George had a son, whom they called Junior.